Hi, I'm Dr. Brad Musil, and this is a reading of the Utility of Religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James. This is section B of part 2 of chapter 1, John Stuart Mill and Utility of Religion. So this is section B, Mill's case against the thesis that religion is morally advantageous. While many are sympathetic to the idea that religion is morally advantageous, others are wary of its implications. Philalethes, Demophiles' foil in Schopenhauer's dialogue, cautions that, quote, you mustn't ascribe to religion what results from innate goodness of character, by which compassion for the man who would suffer by his crime keeps a man from committing it. This is the genuine moral motive, and as such it is independent of all religions. End quote. Footnote 35 cites the source. Philalethes suggests that we are apt to credit religion for inspiring good acts when it is not in fact the true source of them. In Utility of Religion, Mill argues in a similar vein, suggesting that the moral advantages often associated with religion are mistakenly attributed to it, and that the connection between religion and morality is generally overstated and tenuous at best. To begin with, Mill argues that although religion may receive the credit for eliciting moral sentiments present in human beings, in reality the true force behind these sentiments lies primarily in three other factors: 1. Authority, 2. Education, and 3. Public opinion. He believes that there is a tendency to credit, quote, religion as such with the whole of the power inherent in any system of moral duties inculcated by education and enforced by opinion, end quote. Footnote 36 cites the source. In his view, these other underlying factors are what really elicit and encourage moral behavior. Divorce religion from these attendant factors, and it will cease to appear as though it exerts any real influence on or control over human behavior. Ultimately, Mill believes that, quote, since everything of this sort, i.e. the enforcement and teachings of morality, which does takes place in the name of religion, end quote, and, quote, almost all who are taught any morality whatever have it taught to them as religion, end quote, quote, religion receives the credit of all the influence in human affairs which belongs to any generally accepted system of rules for the guidance and government of human life, end quote. Footnote 37 cites the source. Thus, Mill claims that religion only appears to produce moral benefits because of its associations with these more fundamental and powerful forces, and he begins making this case by examining the role that authority plays in the matter. In doing so, he accentuates, quote, the enormous influence of authority on the human mind, end quote, by which he means, quote, an involuntary influence, end quote, that exerts influence on, quote, men's conviction, on their persuasion, and on their involuntary sentiments, end quote. Footnote 38 cites the source. In fact, he maintains that, quote, authority is the evidence on which the mass of mankind believe everything which they are said to know, except facts of which their own senses have taken cognizance, end quote. Footnote 39 cites the source. For Mill, these general reflections on the nature of authority relate to morality because, quote, when any rule of life and duty, whether grounded or not on religion, has conspicuously received the general assent, it obtains a hold on the belief of every individual, stronger than it would have even if he had arrived at it by the inherent force of his own understanding, end quote. Footnote 40 cites the source. The idea here is that much of what we see with respect to the moral beliefs and behaviors of individuals is similar to what we see with respect to their scientific belief. Just as most individuals readily endorse scientific principles and theories that they cannot actually confirm by their own personal experiences, simply because they are widely accepted and backed by experts in the scientific community, so too individuals will adopt the same moral beliefs as others around them, especially those of authoritative figures. What Mill suggests, then, is that when morality is well grounded and a permanent fixture in our lives, it is simply because it is widely recognized and upheld by so many people to begin with, especially by those held in high esteem by society, not because of any religious associations it might have. Mill moves on to discuss the power of education and the role it plays in adherence to a system of morality, especially as it concerns the persuasions of highly impressionable youth. Mill attaches great significance to education, claiming that, quote, there is not one natural inclination which it is not strong enough to coerce, and if needful, to destroy by disuse, end quote. 41 cites the source. Consider, he implores his readers, quote, how unspeakable is the effect of bringing people up from infancy in a belief and in habits founded on it, end quote. Footnote 42 cites the source. Couple this with the fact that, quote, in all countries, all or nearly all who have been brought up by parents or by anyone interested in them have been taught from their earliest years some kind of religious belief. end quote, and it should come, footnote 43 cites the source, and it should come as no surprise that religion has proven to be so influential in the course of human affairs. Mill's point here is that this sort of influence can be garnered by any systemic worldview, religious or otherwise, provided it is impressed on people from an early age, which is to say that any moral benefits associated with this kind of influence are not the exclusive domain of religion. As a result, Mill concludes that, quote, it is reasonable to think that any system of social duty which mankind might adopt, even though divorced from religion, would have the same advantage of being inculcated from childhood, and would have it hereafter much more perfectly than any doctrine has it at present. End quote. Footnote 44 cites the source. It is also worth emphasizing that Mill argues that religious teachings are particularly powerful, as are any kind of teachings for which the following holds true, because children are exposed to them at such an early age. In support of this, he points out that, quote, it is especially characteristic of the impressions of early education that they possess what is so much more difficult for later convictions to obtain, command over the feelings, end quote. Footnote 45 cites the source. With this, Mill suggests that the emotional attachments formed during our youth usually become permanent fixtures within us, difficult to set aside later, even when rational thought would seem to jeopardize them. Footnote 46. As we will see in Chapter 3, James makes a similar case, suggesting that our feelings can, and often do, overrule rational considerations. End of footnote 46. In the end, Mill insists that, once again, religion only seems so powerful because of a greater force, in this case education, associated with it. Remove the advantages of education from religion, and it ceases to appear so morally effective. Alternatively, imbue the young with a system of morality devoid of religion, and it should prove just as effective. Mill points out that this was attempted by the ancient Greek states, which, according to Mill, relied almost exclusively on secular inducements for moral behavior. Footnote 47 cites the source. Quote, among the Greeks generally, end quote, he writes, quote, social morality was extremely independent of religion, end quote, and, quote, such moral teachings as existed in Greece had very little to do with religion, end quote. Footnote 48 cites the source. Interestingly, he adds that, quote, the case of Greece is the only one in which any teaching other than religious has had the unspeakable advantage of forming the basis of education, end quote. Footnote 49 cites the source. It should be noted that since Mill's time, other examples of equally secular, albeit less successful, societies have emerged, for example, the former Soviet Union. In any case, Mill believes that the success of these ancient Greek states supports the, quote, presumption that in other cases earlier religious teaching has owed its power over mankind rather to its being early than to its being religious, end quote. Footnote 50 cites the source. Next, Mill expounds the power of public opinion, suggesting that it too underlies the relationship between religion and morality. Here again, the idea is that much of the credit religion receives in the moral arena ought to really be attributed to a more fundamental force at play, namely, being held in such high regard by the public in the first place. According to Mill, this, public opinion, is really the driving force behind adherence to moral precepts, whether such moral precepts are associated with religion or not. As he puts it, the desire to garner a favorable reputation in society, quote, is a source of strength inherent in any system of moral belief which is generally adopted, whether connected with religion or not, end quote. Footnote 51 cites the source. Mill goes so far as to say that, quote, when the motive of public opinion acts in the same direction with conscience, it is then, of all motives which operate on the bulk of mankind, the most overpowering, end quote. Footnote 52 cites the source. Expanding on why public opinion exerts so much power over our beliefs and behavior, Mill points out that, in addition to fearing the general contempt of our peers, we also face the threat of penalties that such contempt can arouse. Quote, exclusion from social intercourse and from innumerable good offices which human beings require for one another, the forfeiture of all that is called success in life, often the great diminution of total loss of means of subsistence, positive ill offices of various kinds, sufficient to render life miserable, and reaching in some states of society as far as actual persecution to death. End quote. Footnote 53 cites the source. Given these threats, Mill suggests that it's no surprise that we generally endorse the prevalent moral precepts, and I would add, the prevalent religious faiths of our time. Thus he concludes, quote, anyone who fairly and impartially considers the subject will see reason to believe that those great effects on human conduct, which are commonly ascribed to motives derived directly from religion, have mostly for their proximate cause the influence of human opinion. Religion has been powerful not by its intrinsic force, but because it has wielded that additional and more mighty power, end quote. Footnote 54 cites the source. In sum, provided we recognize these three more fundamental forces, Mill thinks religion ceases to appear so morally advantageous. In view of these considerations, what should we make of the idea that religion helps provide the motive to act in moral ways? That is, that it acts as a kind of enforcer of morality. Mill specifically addresses the idea that the supernatural consequences associated with many religions makes them an effective means for soliciting moral behavior. He doesn't think that this is true, and he argues that there is little reason to believe religion inspires moral behavior by way of supernatural threats. First, he argues that the threat of eternal consequences is not palpable enough in our everyday lives to make an appreciable difference in our behavior. He puts the point as follows, quote, rewards and punishments postponed to that distance of time and never seen by the eye are not calculated, even when infinite and eternal, to have on ordinary minds a very powerful effect in opposition to strong temptation. Their remoteness alone is a prodigious deduction from their efficacy on such minds as those which most require the restraint of punishment. End quote. Footnote 55 cites the source. One might argue that all Mill demonstrates here is that eternal consequences are on the horizon of conscious concern, not that eternal consequences play no role in moral motivation whatsoever. However, Mill offers a fairly convincing response to this objection, writing, quote, there is one clear proof how little the generality of mankind, either religious or worldly, really dread eternal punishments, when we see how, even at the approach of death, when the remoteness which took so much from their effect has been exchanged for the close proximity, almost all persons who have not been guilty of some enormous crime, and many who have, are quite free from uneasiness as to their prospects in another world, and never for a moment seem to think themselves in any real danger of eternal punishment. Footnote 56, that's end quote. Footnote 56 cites the source. Footnote 57. However, one could argue that this feeling is historically conditioned. For example, while the fear of judgment and hell may have been lacking during Mill's time, it seemed prominent in the Middle Ages. End of footnote 57. Thus, Mill argues that the threat of eternal punishment is too extreme to serve as a legitimate enforcer of morality, even as death draws nearer. The implication is that it is much too easy to persuade ourselves that we're not going to hell for any of our earthly sins. After all, how can our finite earthly sins justify eternal damnation? Mill echoes this point, saying, quote, even the worst malefactor is hardly able to think that any crime he has had it in his power to commit, any evil he can have inflicted in this short space of existence, can have deserved torture extended throughout an eternity, end quote. Footnote 58 cites the source. And so, quote, he easily persuades himself that whatever may have been his peccadillos, there will be a balance in his favor at the least, end quote. Footnote 59 cites the source. Further, Mill thinks that the extreme nature of hell forces religions incorporating it into a practical dilemma. Quote, bad religions teach that divine vengeance may be bought off by offerings or personal abasement. The better religions, not to drive sinners to despair, dwell so much on the divine mercy that hardly anyone is compelled to think himself irrevocably condemned. End quote. Footnote 60 cites the source. Neither response is promising for those making a case for the moral utility of religion. The first response yields unhealthy and unwanted guilt. Footnote 61. I will discuss the claim that religion fosters guilt in more detail in part 4 of chapter 2. End of footnote 61. And the second response diminishes or entirely eliminates the fear associated with eternal consequences, which those making this case depend upon. These considerations lead Mill to conclude that, quote, the sole quality in these punishments, which might seem calculated to make them efficacious, their overpowering magnitude, is itself a reason why nobody, except a hypochondriac here and there, ever really believes that he is in any real serious danger of incurring them, end quote. Footnote 62 cites the source. Mill offers us another reason to doubt the effectiveness of supernatural consequences when he suggests that, quote, a still greater abatement is their uncertainty, end quote. Footnote 63 cites the source. While there may be some religious individuals who remain so firm in their convictions that they do not ever entertain doubts regarding their accuracy, there are, no doubt, others who are not so steadfast. In the case of the latter, at least, Mill's point holds true. The deterring effect of the supernatural consequences is minimized to the extent that there is uncertainty that such eternal consequences will ever in fact come to fruition. Having shown why he believes religion does not in fact act as an effective enforcer of morality, Mill next considers its merits as a teacher of morality. Again, those advocating this kind of argument suggest that religion can be credited for delivering moral truths to us, regardless of whether it deserves credit for inspiring us to act on them. However, even if this turns out to be true, Mill's view suggests that it is possible to teach these moral principles without the aid of religion. Footnote 64. Recall that Mill argues, quote, "It is reasonable to think that any system of social duty which mankind might adopt, even though divorced from religion, would have the same advantage of being inculcated from childhood and would have it hereafter much more perfectly than any doctrine has it at present." End quote. End of footnote 64. Provided religion helps teach moral principles, if it doesn't turn out to be necessary for this end, in which case there are other suitable teachers of morality available, then the question of whether it is optimal becomes relevant. Mill points to a number of reasons to think that religion is actually morally problematic, which I outline in section C of part 2, in which case it is difficult to think of it as an effective teacher of morality. Footnote 65. Once again, it bears repeating that Mill's reflections regarding this point are primarily concerned with supernatural religions. End of footnote 65. While it's hard to imagine that Mill would go as far as Sigmund Freud, who argues that when it comes to modern religious restrictions, quote, "primitive man was better off in knowing no restrictions of instinct," end quote, footnote 66 cites the source, he does suggest that even supposing religion acts as an effective teacher of morality, there are non-religious alternatives available for introducing moral tenets to people, which also avoid the problems he associates with supernatural religions. I now turn to a discussion of the problems he associates with viewing religion as an effective teacher of morality. First, Mill alludes to the inconsistent teachings and moral recommendations offered by the multiplicity of religions that exist. The central concern here is that religions do not offer us any sort of consensus when it comes to divine moral instruction, and what's worse, they even contradict one another at times. Hence, even granting for the sake of argument that morality is impossible without religious guidance, or that religion is otherwise advantageous when it comes to teaching moral principles, we must still determine the religion or religions for which this is true, which is a difficult task to be sure. The problem is exacerbated when religions recommend disparate and conflicting recommendations for action. For example, many Muslims believe that we ought to dress very modestly while in public. This belief is not, of course, limited to Muslims. Accordingly, many belonging to the Muslim tradition believe that women ought to wear burqas when out in public. However, others belonging to other religious traditions maintain that far from being morally appropriate, this is a cruel and unnecessary infringement on women's rights, and that, if anything, wearing them is morally repugnant. In fact, in 2010, Belgium passed a bill banning any clothing that would obscure the identity of someone in places like parks and in the street. This, in effect, was a ban on burqas. Making matters worse, sometimes different denominations within the same religious traditions uphold different moral standards. After all, not all Muslims advocate women wearing burqas. Also note that throughout history, Christianity has been used to both support and oppose slavery, as well as the death penalty. Footnote 67. For a nice analysis of the variety of Christian takes on the death penalty, see procon.org, and I provide the source for that. End of footnote 67. Many, including several notable philosophers, have also suggested that the teachings of Jesus are at odds with what has come to be known as Christianity. Mohandas Gandhi purportedly once said, quote, "I like your Christ, I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ," end quote. Mill himself speaks of the, quote, "beauty and benignity and moral greatness which so eminently distinguish the sayings and character of Christ," end quote. Footnote 68 cites the source, despite his many reservations about Christianity. He reflects on the inconsistencies between Christianity as we have come to know it, owing in large part, he says, to St. Paul, and the teachings of Christ himself. Footnote 69 cites the source. Along these lines, Carr maintains that, quote, "Mill's quarrel was not with religion per se, but with the social expressions of organized Christianity in the 19th century England," end quote. Footnote 70 cites the source. Nietzsche also talks this way in much of his writing, suggesting that the character of the historical Christ offers a case of someone befitting the Aristotelian notion of nobility, a quality that is requisite for Nietzsche's own master morality, which he views favorably, while Christianity, which is supposed to advance the teachings of Christ himself, is thought to do nothing of the sort. Instead, for Nietzsche, modern-day Christianity signals slave morality and is indicative of an ignoble character, a character who is timid and weak, and whose values encourage a passive and submissive will, rather than an active and virtuous will. I will say much more regarding Nietzsche's views in Chapter 2. In the previous section, I mentioned the argument that religion was historically necessary for the initial introduction of morality to humankind. Regardless of its current moral utility for society, the suggestion here is that religion was, in a sense, historically useful for the sake of morality. On this point, Mill concludes that, quote, there is truth in much of this, considered as a matter of history, end quote, and, quote, in any other way, ancient peoples could not easily have been induced to accept them, that is, moral precepts, end quote. Footnote 71 cites the source. It seems to me that, in granting this historical advantage, Mill neglects another point he emphasizes elsewhere, namely his distinction, quote, between the intrinsic capacities of human nature and the forms in which those capacities happen to have been historically developed, end quote. Footnote 72 cites the source. Similarly, in The Subjection of Women, he acknowledges that, quote, experience cannot possibly have decided between two courses, so long as there has only been experience of one, end quote. Footnote 73 cites the source. Yet Mill seems to rely solely on the course of history when he endorses the idea that religion helped elicit moral sentiments in ancient peoples. Even if it were conceded that history shows us that a significant portion of human beings were aided by religion in the realization of their moral capacities, it tells us nothing more than this. As such, it does not tell us that there were no other possible means by which those same people might have been assisted in their actualization of their moral capacities, and hence that religion was necessary for the process. Nor does it demonstrate that religion was, in fact, the most optimal means available. However, having granted this historical benefit, Mill then wonders, quote, are not moral truths strong enough in their own evidence, at all events to retain the belief of mankind when once they have acquired it? End quote. Footnote 74 cites the source. He concludes that, quote, this benefit, whatever it amounts to, has been gained. Mankind have entered into possession of it. It has become the property of humanity and cannot now be lost by anything short of a return to primeval barbarism. End quote. Footnote 75 cites the source. Hence, in Mill's view, once morality has been introduced to us, there is essentially no chance that we will dismiss its obvious benefits. While he is sympathetic to the case for religion's historical usefulness, he makes it clear that its usefulness does not extend beyond the historical past. Regarding its current social utility, Mill ultimately concludes, quote, belief then in the supernatural, great as are the services which it rendered in the early stages of human development, cannot be considered to be any longer required, either for enabling us to know what is right and wrong, i.e. as a teacher of morality, or as supplying us with the motives to do right and to abstain from wrong, i.e. as a morality enforcer, end quote. Footnote 76 cites the source. So again, that was section B of part 2 of chapter 1, John Stuart Mill and Utility of Religion, from The Utility of Religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James.